Howdy folks, welcome back for another Feature Friday. I'm your host Ryan Glover, and this week I'm not where I usually am. So this week I'm out and about and I'm traveling right now. I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota, visiting a friend, but I realized I didn't record one of these before I left. So I found an office space in a very fancy library. Not really, it's like a little tiny room, tiny like law library thing, but I got a room and I figured, you know what, even if I got to make this quick, I'll do one of these just to keep us consistent here. So what I want to talk about today is something small that I've been working on. So if you've been watching these Feature Fridays or you've seen any of my work before, one of the things that I really love to do is focus on details. So I'm not very big on rough edges. I really like to spend time making sure that things are as polished as I can possibly make them. And as you know, if you've been watching the past few weeks, one of the things that I'm working on right now is the revenue tracking feature inside of Command, the SaaS app that I'm working on. And so as part of that process, one of the things that I have to do, and this is just kind of built in, there's no way around this, is I have to import data from third-party payment processors. So most importantly, or the top of my list right now, is Stripe. And this is actually interesting because I want to say it was last week, Stripe in the middle of the week had an outage. And that was kind of weird because Stripe doesn't really ever go down. But it was one of those moments where it kind of made me aware, like, oh right, you've got to handle what happens if this doesn't work out or if something goes wrong. And so that's what I want to talk about today. I want to show you a little pattern that I came up with to try and circumvent issues like this. Really the thing to keep in mind is that this isn't bulletproof. This isn't something that you just want to like set it and forget it. You're going to have to still monitor your systems and all that sort of stuff. But what it will help you to do is mitigate or at least reduce the number of support requests you get, or just generally like customers freaking out. Because one of the worst things that can happen to a user, especially a non-technical user, is for a system to fail and that system not to give any real valuable feedback or useful feedback for them to do anything. So what I want to show you, and this is kind of in a in-between state, but I'm going to kind of walk you through the logic and how I built this, is on this page right now. What we're looking at is the main screen that you see for the revenue tracker in Command before you've done anything. So this is before you've actually connected to anything. So what I want to show you is what it looks like. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and connect. And I've just got like a dummy account here set up, so this isn't actually any real data or anything like that. But so what's going to happen now is this will run, and this is usually pretty quick. Yeah, this one's quick because it's not that much data. But the point is that process started, and we saw it kind of in that loading state. Now, because this account that I picked out doesn't have a ton of data, it went fast, there weren't any problems, it was okay. But there are going to be situations, more likely than not, that some customers are going to have tons of data. We're talking years and years of data, and I have to import all of that from Stripe and run calculations on it and make sure that it all works. And so it's inevitable that at some point, either because of an API is down or there's a bad network connection or something like that, it's not going to be as smooth as we just saw. So what I want to do is kind of show you how you might want to handle something like this yourself. So this is literally what happens, or what does the user see if this fails. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump over to my database here, and I'm going to close this, and let me rerun this query. So this is the product that we're working on, and I'm going to have to black some of this out here because I've got some secret keys. But the idea here is that when somebody clicks that button to connect to Stripe, what I'm doing is I actually go and do the OAuth request, and then I store their credentials here in the product object. So this is the product that they're actually looking at here in the browser. So you can host multiple products on Command. So this is just for this one Command product. It's kind of keep up with it because I'm using the same names too many times. We'll just call this Pretzel. How about that? So for the Pretzel product, this is the object that stores all of the data about that product, and as part of that I have this integrations object where I store information about all the different accounts, third-party accounts that this user is connected to. So for Stripe, we can see that we've got a few different pieces of data. So we've got a mix of data that I get back from Stripe when I connect the user's account, and I also have data that I'm adding to kind of tell me where are they at in the import cycle. So the import cycle being from the time they click that button and accept the OAuth request all the way up through the time where we're actually getting data, processing it, and then showing them that chart that we saw on screen. So the thing that I came up with earlier is this concept of an initial import failed at. So you can see that there's a pattern here. So I've got initial import queued at and started at as two values. And I also have completed at. So what these are doing, these are just telling me that everything's working as I'd expect. So you've got initial import queued, started, completed. And the way that this works is, so right now I'm looking at the code for the page that we're seeing here. So this is the revenue page. And it changes its state and what it actually displays on screen based on those values in the database. So what I'm doing is I'm saying, and there's a lot here, so, and I actually need to refactor this and clean it up. But the parts that we care about are going to be right about here. So what I'm doing is I'm first checking to see, does this user have a payment processor? So the screen that we first saw when we saw it just said connect to Stripe, that's triggered by this. So what's happening is we're saying, okay, if the user does not have a payment processor, and that's triggered by their call to get revenue. So basically this page loads. So I've got this code running, and this is this component that we see on screen. So everything kind of where the chart is, that's the revenue page. So what's happening is the revenue page loads, and it runs a query, a GraphQL query that goes up to the server, and it calls this script called get revenue. And get revenue is going to try and do one of two things. Either it's saying, you've already connected Stripe before, so I'm going to literally get revenue data for you, or you haven't, and I need to go and fetch the data that I need from Stripe in order to generate that revenue data for you, those revenue calculations for you. So what's going to happen when you haven't done this before, and you'll notice this flag right here, I'm saying first get the payment processor. So the way that I'm doing that is I'm just passing the product ID up as part of that GraphQL query. So I get the product, and then I tell myself who is the payment processor. And what I mean by that is right now I only support Stripe, but I'm kind of thinking ahead here, and I've got support for a few different others. So when I say get the payment processor, what I'm doing is I'm trying to say, have they connected to this account? So have they completed the OAuth process for that account or for that third party? So what I'm doing, if they have, I'm saying, okay, if Stripe exists in this case, go ahead and return an object that tells me all of those import timestamps. So whether they exist or not doesn't matter. It's just give me that back. And you'll notice that this is consistent across all of the different platforms or third parties that this is going to support. So that's the first thing I do. So I go and I get, okay, here's all of the data that I need to know relative to this import for this third party. So that's one. And then two is back down here we can see if that object does not contain an initial import queued at value. So that means put it into the queue. So the way that I've designed this, and there's a point to this, and I think I've mentioned this in one of the more recent videos, which is there's potential for this to be absolutely chaotic on the server and just totally churn up resources and make my life a living hell. So what I did is I put a queue in front of the actual work that needs to be done that would be classified as the import. So the idea here is that this is going to run, and it's going to call this queue payment processor import function, and that's imported from this file. So what this is doing is it's using a library that I really like for this called Bull. And what Bull does is it connects to a Redis database, and Redis is just an in-memory database. So if you think about MongoDB as an object database where you store objects with data in them, Redis is doing the exact same thing, similar, but what it's doing as opposed to writing to the hard disk, the actual hard drive on somebody's computer or the server that's running this code, what it's doing is it's storing it in the memory, which makes it a little faster. And the reason why is you don't have to make a trip to the disk, access the data, and then pull it back out. You're reading it directly from memory, which is a little, and this is where my computer science knowledge is limited, but it's a little closer to the actual request that you're making, so it's easier to get to. It's a little bit faster. So Bull is using Redis as its database, and what that's doing is it's just saying, okay, let's queue up jobs as you hand them to Bull, so as you hand them to this queue. So right here I've got payment processor imports queue being created, and so what I'm doing is I'm just saying, okay, create an instance of this queue, and this is just part of this package. This isn't anything special I'm doing. And so I create the queue, and the thing that I want to call out, I've got two things. So I've got max stalled count of 5. So what that means is once a job's put in the queue, once it gets to the front of the line and it's time to actually run that job or run that import, it's going to make an attempt. Bull's going to try and call the code that I give it, and the code that I give it is right here. So I've got payment processor imports queue process. So what I'm doing is I say, okay, try and run the import. Just see if you can get it to work. And so the way that this is functioning is it gets to the front of the line and we try and run it. And you'll notice that this function right here, so we just mentioned this back in get revenue, this queue payment processor import is the thing that's putting it into lines, putting it in the queue. And so when it does, what it does is it configures Bull to say, I want to try this 5 times. All right, so very simple. So it's going to say, put this job in the queue, try it 5 times until it fails, or if it fails. And so this part right here is saying, okay, and do that on an interval of 1 minute. So literally, Bull's going to run the job. If the job fails, it's going to say, hey, it failed, and then it's going to wait a minute, and then it's going to try it again, wait a minute, and it's going to do that all the way up to a count of 5, and then it's going to stop. And the reason I point that out is that this all plays into how this retry flow that I'm talking about is working. So you'll notice that when I create that queue, so back up here, when I create payment processor imports queue, Bull is giving me a handful of different callback functions that I can call based on events, or these, a better way to say is event handlers. So what I'm doing here is saying, okay, on the failed event, if it occurs, I need to check and see how many attempts of this job have been made that just failed, because literally every time it fails, this event's going to be fired. So what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, and attempts made, you'll notice that I get past a job object from Bull. So I'm taking that job object, and here I'm using the lodash.get method. So I can say pluck off the attempts made property from that job. And that's not something I set, that's something that Bull sets. So what that's going to tell me is how many times has this actually been attempted, how many times has it tried to run this job. And so I know, and I haven't really looked into the configuration for Bull to see if I can automate this, but we're all in the same file, so it's not that big a deal. So what I've done here is I've just hard-coded the number I've got here to match the attempts that I've got here. So if I change this to 7, I would change the one down below to 7. And so what I'm saying by doing that is, if the attempts made equals 5, meaning you've hit the limit that I've set, go ahead and say that, okay, this failed. Something's wrong, something's not right. Because if it fails 5 times consistently, that means that there's something that needs to be fixed, either on my end or, like I mentioned earlier, when Stripe's API went down last week, something is noticeably wrong. So we just want to stop the process, but we also want to tell ourselves. So the tell ourselves part is this timestamp. So you'll notice here that this code is designed to work with any payments processor, not just Stripe. So the way that I'm doing this is I've got in the data that I pass to the job. So if we look right here, so when I actually queue the job, I'm telling myself who this is. So back here, queue payment processor import takes a product ID, and it also takes the name of the payment processor. So in this case, Stripe. So what's going to happen is that's in the queue, and everything's going peachy until it fails. And then the job object that I get has data that I stored as part of that job. So literally when I create the job, I assign a payload to it. So I just give it some data to have on hand. And so what I do is I say, okay, from that data, give me the payment processor, and then also from the job itself, give me the attempts made. So down here I'm saying attempts made equals 5, meaning we've hit our end. Go ahead and on that product, grab the product ID, set integrations.payment processor name. So in this case, it's going to be integrations.stripe. And then I'm saying set the initial import fail that timestamp. So what this is doing, just like the other timestamps that I showed you earlier, is it's telling me, okay, something's wrong or something went wrong. This did not work. So with that information now, what I can do is change how the UI back over here displays. So remember, we had the state where they hadn't connected yet, and we had the state where we were waiting on the import, but then we also have a new state that we have to handle, which is, well, what happens if things go wrong or it doesn't work out? So that's what we're going to do next. So now with that timestamp in the database, and technically speaking, like we saw, the job did execute, it didn't fail. So what we're going to do is we're going to fake this. So what I'm going to do, just make sure I get this right, I'm going to copy initial import fail that, and then we're going to jump over here to the database, And I think my logic is going to pick this up, but if not, we're gonna go ahead and hard code it. You know what? I need a timestamp, so I'm gonna say, ooh, let's take completed at, and we'll just tweak this to say, I don't know, 24. Hopefully that works. So the important part here being that I'm setting initial import failed at as a timestamp on the Stripe integration in my database. That's the important part. Everything else is, you know, not that big a deal. So let's see if I refresh this, if it catches. It did. Perfect. So how? Why did this happen? So notice that at this point we technically know behind the scenes that, yeah, it did work. We're just faking the system out to try and show this view. So the way that this came about is back here in the get revenue component. So again, this is this big one that controls whether this is displayed or the charts are displayed or the different import states are displayed. So the way that we got there is exactly how we saw with the other states. So I've got, okay, if you don't have a payment processor, show you need to connect. And then right beneath that, I have, if you do have a payment processor and we see the initial import failed at timestamp, we want to render the import failed. So just to make sure that's clear, when I send the data back down from the server to the client in response to this request, so again, the get revenue request. So this code right here is running. You'll notice that I resolve with a payment processor, start date of revenue data, and revenue data if it worked, and if it didn't, I just send back the payment processor object. And this object here, so it's not an object, you're like, wait a minute, it's just a variable. So that value is storing an object which is coming back from that get payment processor that we looked at earlier. So here we can see that I've got initial import failed at on that. So that whole thing is sent back to the client. And then back here, if we look, where is it? This one. So what I'm saying is from the data that I got from my GraphQL request, I want to pluck off from the revenue query. So this is the name of the query that ran, and then this is the value that we're targeting. So in this case, we want to say on the payment processor object. So again, that's this whole object as it's returned down here. So we've got it resolving or going back to the client here. That's here. So it's all the exact same stuff. So back here on the client, what I'm saying is, okay, from that payment processor object, try and see if there's initial import failed at. And again, I'm using lodash.get here to kind of anticipate, okay, if this didn't work or something isn't actually set there yet, just return null. So if that's null, okay, we're going to assume that it didn't fail. But if it has a value, meaning it has a timestamp, then down here we're just going to say, okay, well, we have a payment processor, which means they connected, which means we're making the assumption that, okay, they started the import. But then if we also see initial import fail, that means that process failed, kind of like all the steps we walked through earlier. So if I go and look, now what I'm saying is just return this render import failed. There's not much to this. So I've mentioned this before, but command is being built with pup, which is the boilerplate that I use with mentorship customers at Clever Beagle. And so this has a few different components built into it that I've found kind of add to the experience of building a product. And one of those is blank state. So blank state is just a way for you to show information like this. Literally, if there's no data, it's quote unquote blank. So we have to show something, or we should show something. So blank state allows you to display an icon or an image, a title, some text, and if you want, you can also have some sort of action. So what I've done is I've taken this blank state component, and over here I've created another version of it, or I should say a styled version of it, because this is a styled component. So if we look back at the top of this file, I'm importing that. It's bigger than I thought. There we go. So we've got payment processor import failed. This is being imported from styles. So this is literally relative to this current folder. So this is this file right here, and you can see that at the top, I'm importing that blank state component from the components directory, and then I'm using styled components to say, okay, create a styled version of that. So literally, you pass the component instance, I guess, yeah, I guess you would call it that, yeah. Yeah, you pass the component instance to styled, and it's going to wrap it, and it's going to attach these styles that you specify here to that component. And then we just give it a name to kind of signify back to us, like, what is this? So technically speaking, this is a copy of the blank state component, but the way we've styled it, we know that that represents the payment processor import failed component. So back over here, we import that from our styles file, and then inside of, I've made a grave mistake because I don't remember. Let's see, render payment or import failed. There you go. So what I'm doing is I'm displaying that style version of the blank state component, and then I'm just passing general information to it that maps to the blank state component's API. So we can see we've got, if you have an image, display the image. If you have an icon, display the icon. Title, subtitle. If you have an action, display that. So back over here, all I do is say, okay, I'm going to use the exclamation triangle, which is this goober right here. And then I say, okay, the import failed, something went wrong. And this is the important part. So this is the user experience part of this, which is, okay, not only am I telling them that something went wrong. So you want to think about how you design your system as, this is going to sound condescending, but it's not meant to, which is kind of like your user is in a maze, right? And they're bouncing between all the points of your maze. And the points of your maze are your features or the different things they can interact with. And sometimes they're going to get to a dead end. And so the way that you want to think about designing the user experience for your product is you want to create trap doors. So if they get to a dead end, so literally they're facing a wall, they should see a trap door to the side, which will either get them out of that or help them get to some form of resolution, because there's nothing more obnoxious for a user than to encounter a dead end and there's no actual information or anything helpful, because then what that means, your users have to scramble, and then because you're the one that made them scramble, their opinion of you and ultimately the product kind of goes down. And if you repeat that multiple times throughout a product, eventually you're just going to lose the customers. So this is a way to kind of get around that, or at least help to prevent it. It doesn't mean that it's always going to work, but it'll at least kind of buffer that problem a little bit. So what I'm saying is, okay, here's what went wrong, but then I tell you, click the button below to retry. So you're giving the user control. You're not just leaving them in this kind of like limbo state. You're saying, okay, go ahead and retry. Even if we know, like in the case of Stripe's API is down, there's not much I can do about that, but giving the user control, or we'll say the illusion of control, is a great way to, again, buffer that problem of them getting frustrated or upset. Because if they feel like they're in control, at the very least, if it fails twice, then they're going to be a little more forgiving, because then they're going to think like, oh yeah, something's wrong. So they're not just going to jump to say like something's wrong with your system. They're going to be a little less, keyed up and angry or something like that, or at least there's less potential for that. So again, and I've also, let me point this out too. So I'm saying something went wrong. Don't worry, this can happen from time to time. But then I say we've been alerted and we'll get in touch if necessary. So not only am I giving them control by saying go ahead and click to retry, but I'm also telling them if this is something really serious, I'm going to get in touch, or somebody's going to get in touch. And so not only having this feature is important, but the way that you word it. So another big thing that I like to pay attention to is copywriting. And I can't stress this enough. It's very much worth your time to just look into writing just copy in general, so just sales copy and marketing copy, but also something called micro copy. And I'm going to link to a book down below. I'm pretty sure there's a book that I've read on this. And micro copy is stuff like this. It's not really long paragraphs of text or sales copy or anything like that, but it's like little bits and bobs of information that are helping your users to do stuff, either to get out of a negative situation or to navigate a positive situation. It doesn't matter, but micro copy are those little bits of text that are kind of guiding the user along. And if you really take the time to get that right, it's just going to improve the overall experience for your users. So that's pretty much it. So you'll notice here, I haven't actually wired up the retry yet, but it's the thought that counts. So back here, the idea is if this goes through the process 5 times, it fails, we set that timestamp. This query is going to respond with an initial import fail that timestamp, and based on that, I'm going to say, okay, I want to render this screen, communicate to the user, let them retry. So the next step is going to be, okay, just actually run the import again. So I'm going to give them direct access to that. Or in this case, what I'll do is I'll say, okay, go ahead and reschedule the job or add that job back to the queue. And then that way, now we've closed the loop, or we've completed the loop. So our user isn't hitting this dead end. They're literally saying like, oh, well, that's not great, but at least I can get out of it and kind of get back into the groove. And best case scenario, and this is what hopefully happens, is whatever went wrong the first time was just a fluke. Maybe it was like a network hiccup. There wasn't actually an API down or anything. It was just network connection issues. And the second time they retry, it works, and there you go. And so that not only gives your users control, but it's also getting you out of having to deal with tracking down what went wrong or sniffing through logs and stuff like that. Just all the boring, not fun stuff. And also dealing with angry customers is never fun. So that's going to do it for this week. Hopefully that was helpful, and this is something that if you're building your own product, you'll consider adding, because again, it takes a little bit of time. It's not the easiest thing to do, but doing it is going to save you a ton of time and headaches later in dealing with customers and dealing with your system not working how it should. So that's going to do it for me, folks. Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, make sure to click the red button down below to subscribe. And if you haven't as well, hit the bell right next to it to get notifications as soon as these are released. So signing off for the HMS Beagle. I'll see you next week, folks.